Hello and welcome. You're listening to Set B Productions. My name is Rana. A warm Mediterranean climate, an extremely low rate of crime, and a welcoming friendliness to outsiders has made Portugal one of the top spots for immigration in the EU, not to mention a few tax benefits and a very generous visa program to encourage it along. This historic nation is brimming with museums, wineries, beaches, castles, and sometimes several of those in one. It's experienced a few rocky years as the rest of the world has, but has weathered the storm without losing what makes Portugal special. Let's dive in. General culture. It's hard to know where to begin with Portugal's culture. Shall we begin with the historical, with the kicking off of the age of discovery that they did and are still justifiably proud of? The rich history of contributions to the rest of the world that has shaped so much of what we think of as indistinguishable from where it's currently most famous, such as introducing tea to Great Britain, tempura to Japan, or samosas to India? Shall we begin instead with cuisine, with bacalhau or salted cod, something their diet has revolved around for centuries? No, instead I think it's best to begin with what ties all these together, the Portuguese love of the sea. They're inextricably tied to it, culturally, historically, and gastronomically, and from what I can tell most wouldn't have it any other way. The furthest you can even get from the ocean is only about 130 miles, or about 210 kilometers, so you're really honestly never more than a day trip away from an Atlantic beach. If you're going to be sailing, especially for a long time, obviously the most important thing is that your wine be fortified, so that it doesn't spoil during the trip, which is where one of their most famous drinks comes in, port. Port is just wine that's had some distilled grape spirits like brandy added to it to halt the fermentation process, leaving a sweeter, stouter drink than your typical wines. And what better to accompany a glass of port than the dulcet sounds of fado music, a unique string-based music that brings with it a certain mood called saudade, a melancholic nostalgia or yearning for lost loves. No description alone can do it justice. Take a listen. As the music indicates, it's a laid-back way of life, a little slower and more down-to-earth than in many areas, and everything I've read and seen has borne that out. Time is taken to appreciate the little things in life, and if that means opening the shop an hour later, that means the shop is going to open an hour later, and that's just the way it's going to be. Time is taken for the little things in the best of ways when you're relaxed, and in the worst of ways when you're in a hurry. But perhaps that's a built-in cultural method of forcing life to slow back down. Expect things to open later, start later, stay open later, and continue going later than elsewhere. The Portuguese are well known for their festivals, especially in the month of June, and absolutely love a good celebration. Their festivals often revolve around religious tradition, which makes sense as Roman Catholic tradition still dominates life to a much greater degree here than it does in many areas of Europe. 81% identify as Roman Catholic, though most consider themselves to be non-practicing. Still, it's a matter of national and cultural identity for them more than purely religious affiliation, and Roman Catholic traditions and celebrations make up a great deal of the cultural landscape. No discussion of the culture of Portugal could be complete without a mention of their favorite sport, football, or, as we call it in the US, soccer. One of the oldest clubs still around was founded all the way back in 1876, so their love of the sport stretches a long way back indeed. Portugal regularly finishes very high in the FIFA World Standings and, as of the 23rd of June 2022, is 9th in the world. Geography and climate change. Portugal's mainland is roughly divided by the Tagus River into two zones, a drier, warmer southern area dominated by rolling plains and a mountainous, cooler, wetter area to the north. The interior can be a lot drier than the ocean-facing areas due to the rain shadow effect, where moisture comes off the ocean, hits the mountains, dumps the rain, and then doesn't have much left to go inland. But, as we discussed earlier, it's hard to get too far from the ocean in Portugal in the first place. You're going to get some rain here or there. 39.7% of Portugal's land is used for agricultural purposes, while a very respectable 37.8% remains forested. They're especially known for their cork trees and cork products, with the remaining 22.5% of land being used for everything else. Portugal is notably not on the Mediterranean Sea, but it has a Mediterranean climate with warm, sunny, temperate weather similar in many ways to California. Winters are chilly, wet, and gray, but mercifully brief, and spring and autumn appear to generally be mild and in a hurry to get out of the way and let a long, lazy summer run the show. It rarely dips below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or 4.4 degrees Celsius, or above 94 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 34.4 degrees Celsius. It's pretty much a paradise. Unfortunately, it's also one of the most vulnerable areas of Europe to the effects of climate change and is going to feel the impacts in the coming years. It's already begun to see increasing temperatures, heat waves, droughts, and forest fires, and can expect all of those to continue to accelerate in their increase as time moves on. Sea level rise is of particular concern to a nation that makes so much of its living from the ocean, and in particular, one that has two autonomous territories that are islands in the Azores and Madeira. If trends continue, coastal communities are at threat of being submerged and ultimately wiped out. Reduced precipitation puts their olive and wine industries at risk to the north, and all of it threatens the tourist industry that's become so vital to all of Portugal in recent years. Times are going to get a bit rougher in terms of climate change, and some tough choices are going to have to be made about where and when to spend resources. The numbers I've been able to find are slightly out of date, but should be fairly representative of the current situation in terms of food security. As best I can tell, Portugal is fairly self-sufficient in terms of most food production that's needed, with a surprising reliance on importing frozen, dried, or salted fishing products. Portugal is among the 44 countries in the world that has gone through at least 40% of their water resources so far, putting them at risk of water scarcity in the future. With predicted future precipitation rates lower and lower each year, it'll become harder and harder to refill those reserves. But I want to stress that they're still a very long way from some Mad Max-style apocalypse. They're just having to be smart about how they will use their resources, and knowing the Portuguese, that smart usage is very likely to be the outcome. Legal matters. The incarceration rate in Portugal in 2021 was 110.8 per 100,000 and has consistently fallen for the last several years. This compares with Spain, is a little higher than Canada, and is a bit lower than France. The point is that they're right about average among many of their European peers, and while some have numbers around 70 per 100,000, such as Norway or Sweden, Portugal is definitely trending in a downward trajectory, and things are looking as good as they can. The prison system itself is old and in need of some refurbishment, both at a physical level and at a personnel level. Some funding was initially allocated, at least to the buildings, but it sounds like that hit a few roadblocks and ultimately stalled out, and as the report from the European Prison Observatory, linked below, makes clear, there's a breakdown in the chain of command that leads to each prison acting like its own little island with its own set of rules, which can lead to some very poor conditions indeed. Speaking of which, conditions in Portuguese prisons are atrocious. Overcrowding, small amounts of very low-quality food, oppressive heat in the summer, and extreme cold in the winter, with no provisions including windows or adequate clothing or even blankets being provided in many cases, guards simply not responding to cries for help, and a variety of other abuses have all been observed and recorded as a matter of practice more than an exception. The general view of the Portuguese police is not a fantastic one, with allegations of corruption and mismanagement abounding, but there have been some legislative attempts to fix that. Results so far have been mixed. There is no distinction made between someone being held for trial and someone that's been convicted, so it's hard to stress this enough. Avoid becoming entangled with the Portuguese police at nearly any cost. Thankfully, that honestly shouldn't be too much of an issue. Portugal is an extremely safe country with extremely low rates of crime. In fact, depending on the source and the year, Portugal tends to be the third or the fourth safest in the world. But let's say that things have gone poorly and you have been arrested. You should still be informed of your rights prior to being questioned, including your right to a lawyer and your right to remain silent, including that silence not being counted against you. Your trial is almost certainly going to be in front of a judge, not a jury, and you can expect to be held for between 6 to 18 months before a trial is held. But it can stretch on for much longer. The maximum time allowed is 2 years and 6 months. It would be irresponsible not to bring up Portugal's drug laws, which are perhaps the most liberal in the Western world. They came into effect in July of 2001 and decriminalized possession of less than 10 days' personal supply of just about any drug you could name. That doesn't mean it's legal, that just means you won't be arrested for it, and that treatment for addiction is the preferred next step as opposed to punishment and prison time. This has led to a tremendous reduction in HIV cases among drug users, which was the primary stated goal, so by that measure, this has been a resounding success. Drug-related pathologies such as sexually transmitted diseases or deaths decreased dramatically. At the same time, reported lifetime use of drugs in general increased, but that could be due to increased candor from interviewees as there was no longer anything to fear by disclosing drug habits. It's important to note that the increase corresponds to an increase in Spain and Italy as well, where drugs for personal use were decriminalized years before Portugal. Drug use among adolescents declined, drug-related criminal justice workloads decreased, and the street value of most illicit drugs dropped significantly. To some, this counts as a roaring success. To others, this is a resounding failure. It mostly boils down to where you land on the slightly, and I do mean slightly, increased lifetime drug use reported, and whether or not it's worth all the other social impacts this has had. From my perspective, I truly have a difficult time seeing the negatives. Lastly, because I know it'll be asked, no, marijuana is not legal for recreational purposes in Portugal. It is, however, entirely legal for medical purposes. The future. The future is going to be a bit messy, I can guarantee that much, but little else. Let's look internally first, and let's start with politics. They have what's called a semi-presidential system, where they have a 230-seat parliament and a prime minister, but a president as well. As with any country, there are plenty of ups and downs, and no political party, especially in an open and free democracy, is devoid of plenty of criticism. Since the Carnation Revolution in 1974, 4 primary political blocs have dominated the political landscape: the far left, the socialists, the center-right, and the right wing. Because the Carnation Revolution overthrew a fascist right-wing dictatorship, fascist political parties are unconstitutional, and conservative right-wing political parties are traditionally quite unpopular in Portugal, with some recent changes that we'll get into momentarily. The government has generally oscillated back and forth between coalitions of the socialists and the center-right, or the center-right and the right wing, with the socialists also having an outright majority some of the time. The 2008 financial crisis that hit America hit Portugal a little later, spiking hardest in 2010 through 2014 and requiring a bailout of the country, causing significant political unrest as intense austerity policies were applied that still have not been entirely rolled back. That political unrest has continued and magnified, and in 2019, Chega burst onto the scene. Chega, meaning enough, is a right-wing, nationalist, conservative political party that has managed to soar to become the 3rd most powerful in parliament in the last election, though they do only control 5.2% of the seats. As with elsewhere in the world, divisive populist politics have begun to arise in Portugal to a much stronger degree than before, leaving the political future hazy at best. Nationalism versus globalism is becoming as much a dividing factor as traditional right versus left, and tribalism is slowly growing, though, again, this is largely a global phenomenon, not unique to Portugal, and as with the financial crisis, these things arrive later in Portugal than they do elsewhere. COVID has hit Portugal brutally hard, with over 5 million reported infections and over 23,700 deaths, a significant portion of which came in this January alone. In a country with a population of 10.3 million people, that means about half of the entire population so far has had COVID. They responded very strongly initially, and the results looked promising, but at this point the country appears to be exceptionally weary of COVID restrictions. Thankfully, vaccination rates are extremely high, with enough being successfully distributed to give every citizen their 2nd dose and then some. While their healthcare system is not under the enormous strain it was under during the worst of the spikes of infection, it's still under quite a load, and masks are still required in public transports, such as buses, trains, or taxis, as well as in healthcare facilities like hospitals or nursing homes. The pandemic and the associated recession has put quite an obstacle in the way of an economy that was otherwise growing at a slow but steady rate since the impact of the 2008 financial crash that hit everywhere. Just as recovery was really starting to take off, the pandemic tripped them up, and there's plenty of pain left ahead before we get back to smoother waters. Despite dropping year by year for the last several years, the unemployment rate has grown since 2019 and now sits at 7.2%. Income inequality sits a bit higher than in most advanced economies, and GDP per capita sits about 37% lower than the OECD's best performers. This makes Portugal a modest and respectable performer among its peers, neither outstandingly terrible or incredible in terms of its economy, and it can expect the same somewhat rough road to recovery that most of the rest of the world can in the coming years. Portugal is a net energy importer, with what looks to be the overwhelming majority of their total energy coming in from out of the country. With that being said, they generate more electricity than they need and export some of it, with 57% coming from renewable sources and the remaining 43% coming from non-renewable fossil fuel sources. They aim to be entirely climate neutral by 2050 and to cover 80% of their electric consumption with renewable means by the year 2030, so they're well on their way and making great progress. Nuclear power is strictly non-commercial in Portugal and is used only for research or medical applications at this point in time, with no immediate plans to change that. As an EU member, they largely have the same external pressures and problems that most EU members do right now. For example, what to do about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and whether or not to accept Ukraine as an EU member, that sort of thing. But it's important to keep in mind that Portugal is a country least affected by the war, partly geographically due to being far away, partly because they don't import or export goods to or from Russia that are impacted by the sanctions, and partly because they largely do not rely on Russian energy in the first place. Portugal is caught between two historic partnerships with China and the United States, each with very different visions for the future. The Sines Peninsula is a great example. There's a natural deepwater port there that the Chinese see as vital to their Belt and Road Initiative as a cargo port, and the old Portuguese colony of Macau, returned to China in 1999, has served as a bridge for friendly bilateral relations between the two countries. When the financial crisis hit and Portugal needed bailed out, the US was nowhere to be found, but China stepped up with ready foreign investment, particularly in the telecommunications and engineering sectors, winning them a lot of favor. At the same time, the US wishes to use the port to bring in liquefied natural gas to help not only Portugal, but also all of Europe, particularly to combat Russian energy on the continent. Portugal has maintained a long-standing good relationship with the US, having a US military base on the Azores since World War I and being a founding member of NATO. They've drawn plenty of criticism internally, from the EU and of course from the US over their relationship with China, and have struggled to maintain a neutrality that may be running out of road. Both sides in this rivalry want to know which way Portugal will go, but Portugal itself doesn't seem to have that answer yet. Portugal has maintained a fantastic relationship with many of its neighbors, particularly historically with Great Britain and in modern times with France, where about 2 million of its citizens currently reside. Still, it's hard to find a better relationship than the one they currently have with Spain, which has historically been like a brother. A brother that occasionally gets in an all-out war with you, but an Iberian brother nonetheless. Look, there's a reason for all the castles and fortifications from long ago. So, how easy would it be to move there and start a life? Well, there are 3 types of visas that Portugal offers: short, temporary, or long-term stay options, but we're really only interested in the last category as it'll let us stay there for more than a year. There are 3 famous long-term stay options, each of which offer the same set of benefits. You can freely travel and live in the 26 EU countries. You can live, work, and study in Portugal. You can bring your family along with a reunification visa. There's a path to Portuguese citizenship for you after 5 years of residency, and there are tax incentives to boot. The first option is called the Golden Visa, which I won't spend too much time on. Basically, if you can plop down €500,000 of investment, you can get a visa and you're good to go. If you're buying real estate, that €500,000 can be lowered to as little as €350,000, but there are restrictions on where you can buy. Post-Brexit, this is about the easiest way that a UK citizen can get the equivalent to the freedoms they had pre-Brexit, and many with the means have opted to simply buy their way back into Europe, leading to a relatively sudden influx of UK buyers. The second option is called the D2 visa, and it's for freelancers, entrepreneurs, and independent service providers looking to set up shop in Portugal. You'll need to prove that you have a viable business plan that will actually benefit Portugal, not just you, and that you have the money to actually start the business, as well as proving that you already have the income necessary to take care of you and yours in order to get approval for this one. This is the least popular and the least well-known of the 3 visa options. The last and the most popular is called the D7 visa, also known as the retirement visa or the passive income visa. So long as you can prove at least €8,460 per year of income, plus 50% of that for a spouse and another 30% of that per child, you're good. That's about the only requirement, other than a clean criminal record, of course. The cost of living is far, far cheaper than it is in the US or in many Western nations, and your money can go a lot further than it might be able to back where you're from. Housing, groceries, and eating out are all going to be noticeably less expensive, but that's going to carry over for most other things as well. You're going to pay a little bit more than you're used to, perhaps, for things like electricity or gasoline, but overall your monthly expenses should put a significant cushion back into your wallet. From what I can tell, there is not a shortage of housing, though the more popular areas of Lisbon and Porto are becoming increasingly difficult to find a home in. You may need to look a bit further afield and get into deeper Portugal a little more to find exactly the home you were looking for. Integrating into society is said to be extremely easy, with a welcoming and open mentality suffusing the culture. Naturally, these are people we're talking about, and exceptions will prove the rule, but on average, you shouldn't have any trouble fitting in with the locals if you're open and friendly as well. Healthcare. Healthcare in Portugal is typically excellent, with exceptionally high marks for infrastructure. The WHO ranks it 12th in the world for overall healthcare efficiency. Unlike many other places, private insurance is not that common, but of course it's far from unheard of and is extremely affordable when it's needed. Practically speaking, the general healthcare system covers everyone for free that's part of their social system, or if they're an EU citizen. So if you're a legal resident or are a citizen, you're covered. The only exception is dental care, but prices are generally very low for anything that you need to pay for out of pocket, ranging from a couple of euros for a doctor's visit to about 25 euros for a dental cleaning. From what I've been able to find, the quality of healthcare is very comparable to what you would find in the United States in a very positive sense, and as long as you're a resident of Portugal, you should be very, very well covered. If you're there on a visa, you're going to need private health insurance, but you're still going to be paying far less than you would be in the States. Education. Basic public education is free and required by law for everyone from ages 6 through 18 or year 12 of school, whichever comes first. This is a very high-quality education. 15-year-old Portuguese students regularly outscore their OECD peers in terms of reading literacy, mathematics, and scientific knowledge. This is a big step forward from their previous way of doing things. Under the dictatorship, students were only required to go to school for 3 years, leading to a situation where fewer than 30% of adult Portuguese have graduated from high school. Not college, high school. That compares quite poorly with, for instance, Germany, where the number is about 85%, or the US, where that number is about 90%, if you include GEDs. This is another obstacle to economic recovery that has really kneecapped them, but they're working hard to change this with several adult education programs that mostly boil down to preparing for and testing at grade 9 and 12 levels. Things are improving drastically and rapidly, with dropout rates of about 44% still remaining in 2001, but by 2019, the last year I was able to find solid numbers for, that dropout rate was down to just 10%. Truly remarkable improvement. After graduation, students may apply to their choice of many excellent universities and polytechnic institutes, including one of the oldest continuously operating universities in the world, the University of Coimbra, founded all the way back in 1290. And an increasing number do. More than a third, 36.2%, move on to higher education of some form. While that's slightly below average for the EU, that's only a little below the average of 39%, and is above Italy and Romania at 27.8% and 24.6% respectively. Public higher education in Portugal is very inexpensive for EU citizens or those who have been living legally in Portugal for more than 2 years, costing just an administrative fee of 697 euros per year. Entry is based on your grades, or if you're over 23, on an exam that you can sit for that will stand in for your grades. Schools, of course, have discretion over who they will admit or decline, and so long as you can pass the test with a high enough score, you will likely be able to obtain entry to a public university. Whether or not that translates to acceptance into one of their extremely prestigious advanced programs is another matter entirely, as those spots are fiercely competitive. Each university and each program in each university will have its own admittance criteria there. Social safety net. Portugal has a robust social safety net that covers many things. Let's begin at the beginning, with birth. Mothers get 4 months of paid-for maternity leave following the birth of a child, and fathers get 5 days, plus another 10 that they can take within the next 30 days, but they do not need to be taken consecutively. They offer family benefits, such as help to families with children that are struggling. They offer disability assistance for those in need. What we refer to as Social Security in the United States is called old age pension and is divided into 2 sections, the old age pension and the social old age pension. The old age pension is for those that have worked in Portugal and paid into the system for their working lives, while the social old age pension appears to be more for those that just happen to find themselves of age and in Portugal at the time. It applies not only to Portuguese residents and citizens, but also to residents of EU member states, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland, Cape Verde, Australia, and Brazil, and both kick in at 66 and a half years old. There are survivors' benefits for those that have outlived their beneficiary through one means or another, 2 forms of pension in a survivor's pension and a widow's and orphan's pension, and 1 lump sum payment called a death grant that is meant to assist with the extra expenses that arise with the reorganization of family life. Social integration income is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, income meant to help people continue to be part of a society. If conditions have gotten so bad that they're at risk of no longer being able to be a meaningful part of society, Portugal can help them out. Unemployment works very similarly to the way it does in many Western nations. You need to have been working for 360 days of the last 24 months, need to be registered at the employment office and actively seeking work, and you'll only get a portion of your former salary, but it should help keep your head above water while you look for something new. They have an interesting quirk where the amount of time you can spend on unemployment increases as your age increases, from 150 days to begin with to 540 days by the time you're over 50. It's important to note that the welfare system in Portugal is fairly young, with welfare traditionally being the realm of the Catholic Church and charity. As the country has secularized and moved into the modern age, this has proven to be incompatible with modern needs, and the dictatorship under Salazar attempted to begin addressing that with a fledgling welfare system. That system expanded dramatically in capability and competency after the Carnation Revolution, but even through the 90s, Portugal struggled economically, and there has always been a bit of a gap between what it wants to do and what it's got the money to do, which honestly could apply to anywhere. Regardless, it's doing what it can with what it has, and it continues to make strides to take the best care of its people that it can. Transportation. Transportation in Portugal is typically very easy and fairly inexpensive. Their infrastructure is exceptionally well maintained, and the cities especially are extremely walkable. What's less walkable will be easily reached through readily available public transit systems they have versions of all over the place. Trams and trolleys seem to run everywhere in cities, and inexpensive, clean, and reliable buses and trains serve any longer routes than those trams and trolleys around the country. While ferry service does handle some trips out to the Azores and Madeira, a flight will be your more likely mode of transportation there, with that likely being the only time a flight makes sense for you in Portugal. Everywhere else is simply too close and easy to make the hassle worth it. Ride-sharing and taxi services also exist and have a good reputation. If you want to drive, you'll have a good time doing so, but you'd better enjoy every mile of it. The roads are in exceptionally good shape and the drivers are good as well, but gas at the time of writing costs the equivalent of $8.43 per gallon US. General freedom. Portugal is exceptionally free, with a score of 96 out of 100 from Freedom House. By comparison, the US sits at 83 out of 100, the UK at 93, Canada at 98, and Australia at 95. That means that this is a stable, functional parliamentary democracy with regular transfers of power between political parties, functioning largely as it ought to be. Primary concerns boil down to some corruption, the effects of racism and xenophobia, and the poor and abusive conditions of prisoners. Reproductive rights are respected in Portugal, with abortions being legal through 10 weeks of pregnancy. Portugal is one of the friendliest places for LGBTQ folks, being free to marry, adopt, inherit, or apply for visas based on family reunification with your partner. Gun ownership is legal in Portugal, and about 22 out of every 100 Portuguese own a firearm. Freedom of religion is a constitutionally protected right, as is freedom of expression and information and freedom of the press. That freedom of expression extends to all of the media. These foundational freedoms keep Portugal a free and open nation. Life under a repressive dictatorship is well within living memory of many, and these freedoms are fiercely defended if it is felt they are being encroached upon.
Alright, time for a montage.
And that's Portugal. Portugal is a nation with a rich history and a natural wonder, a beautiful culture, and a charming people. It faces challenges just like everywhere else on the planet, but is well situated to recover from the rough economic times it currently finds itself in, and is consistently making progress in every metric I've looked at so far. It's positioned for a bright future in the EU and on the world stage, and there's a darn good reason so many expats and retirees make their way to Portugal to live out their lives. But would you do the same? Would you live in Portugal? Let us know in the comments below, and let us know where we should cover next. Thank you for watching.